The most tragic victim of the Palm Springs betrayal was the relationship itself. Jack and Frank had genuinely loved each other, not in a political way, not as allies of convenience, but as true friends. They had shared dreams, secrets, moments of vulnerability that bound them together across the vast differences in their backgrounds. Jack Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. When Frank heard the news, he locked himself in his bedroom and cried for hours. Not for the president, but for the friend he had lost long before Dallas. The man who died in that motorcade was already a stranger to Frank, but the memory of their friendship haunted him. Years later, when asked about his relationship with President Kennedy, Frank would always deflect. "We were friends for a while," he would say, with that practiced Sinatra nonchalance. "Then we weren't." But those close to Frank knew the truth. The betrayal in Palm Springs had wounded him in ways that never fully healed. Frank had given his loyalty completely to Jack Kennedy, and Jack had thrown it away for political convenience. It was a lesson Frank never forgot. In the world of power, friendship is always expendable. Frank Sinatra lived for another 33 years after John F. Kennedy's assassination. He achieved unprecedented success, became a global icon, accumulated vast wealth and influence, but he never again trusted a politician completely. He never again believed that friendship could survive the corrupting influence of power. The helicopter pad was eventually rebuilt, but not for presidents. Frank used it for his own private jet, a symbol of his independence from the political world that had rejected him. The Palm Springs betrayal taught Frank Sinatra the most painful lesson of his life. Loyalty is not a currency that appreciates over time. You can spend decades building trust, making sacrifices, proving your devotion, and it can all be erased with a single phone call when political convenience demands it. Frank never spoke John F. Kennedy's name in public after 1962. When reporters asked about their friendship, Frank would simply say, "The president and I had different ideas about loyalty," but the pain never fully disappeared. Friends would sometimes catch Frank staring at old photographs from the 1960 campaign, pictures of two young men who believed their friendship could survive anything. The broken helicopter pad became Frank's most powerful metaphor for American politics. You build something beautiful, something meaningful, something that represents your deepest beliefs about friendship and loyalty. And then, when it's no longer useful to the people in power, they tell you to destroy it yourself. Frank Sinatra went on to live a legendary life. He sang for presidents, kings, and common people. He made movies, built an empire, became an icon, but he never again made the mistake of believing that political power and personal friendship could coexist. The kid from Hoboken had learned the hardest truth of all. In Washington, everyone is expendable. Even the chairman of the board. "Get me Hedda Hopper," Frank told his assistant. Hedda Hopper was Hollywood's most influential gossip columnist, a woman who could destroy careers with a single paragraph. When Hedda came on the line, Frank's voice was calm, controlled, deadly. "Hedda, darling, I've got a story for you about our president and his interesting travel arrangements." "Frank, what kind of story?" "The kind that asks questions about why the leader of the free world suddenly prefers the company of Republicans to the friends who helped elect him." Frank knew exactly what he was doing. He was threatening to expose Jack's hypocrisy, his willingness to abandon the people who had made his presidency possible. It was political blackmail, pure and simple. But the threat backfired. Instead of bringing Jack back to his side, it convinced the Kennedy administration that Frank Sinatra was exactly the kind of liability they couldn't afford. Bobby Kennedy heard about Frank's conversation with Hedda Hopper within hours. He immediately called Jack. "That's it," Bobby said. "Sinatra just threatened to destroy you in the press because you hurt his feelings. This is exactly why we can't trust him." Jack felt sick to his stomach, but he knew Bobby was right. Frank's reaction proved that he was too emotional, too volatile, too dangerous to maintain a relationship with. A real friend would have understood the political necessities. A real friend wouldn't have threatened retaliation. The final break came when Frank's behavior reached its peak of vindictiveness. He not only destroyed the helicopter pad, but had it removed entirely, leaving just a patch of dirt where the presidential seal had been. Then he planted a tree in the exact spot, a middle finger to the Kennedy administration that everyone in Palm Springs understood. But Frank's most devastating revenge was quieter, more personal. He removed every photograph of Jack Kennedy from his home. Every picture from campaigns, parties, private moments, all of it went into boxes that were stored in his basement. Frank erased Jack Kennedy from his life as completely as Jack had erased him from the presidency. When word of Frank's actions reached the White House, Jack Kennedy finally understood that he hadn't just lost a political ally. He had made a dangerous enemy. The destruction of Frank Sinatra's helicopter pad became legend in Palm Springs within days. Word spread through the desert community like wildfire. The man who had helped elect a president had literally destroyed the landing pad built for that same president. It was a gesture so dramatic, so final, that everyone understood its meaning. The friendship between Frank Sinatra and John F. Kennedy was over. But the real damage went far deeper than broken concrete. Frank had lost more than a friend. He had lost his place in the American power structure. For 3 years, he had been an unofficial member of the Kennedy administration. He had attended state dinners, advised on policy, influenced appointments. The kid from Hoboken had reached the absolute pinnacle of American society. Now he was an outsider again. Worse than an outsider, he was a liability. The FBI increased their surveillance of Frank's activities. The IRS began auditing his finances with unusual intensity. Booking agents started getting quiet calls suggesting that certain venues might not want to host Frank Sinatra anymore. The Kennedy administration's message was clear: cross us, and there will be consequences. But Frank wasn't the only one who paid a price for the Palm Springs betrayal. Jack Kennedy lost something irreplaceable that weekend: his connection to the world outside politics. Frank had been Jack's window into real America, into the streets and clubs and neighborhoods where ordinary people lived their lives. Frank had kept Jack grounded, human, connected to something beyond the cold calculations of Washington power. Without Frank, Jack became more isolated, more dependent on the political advisors who saw everything through the lens of electoral advantage. The man who had once been known for his charisma and common touch began to seem distant, calculating, overly managed. Peter Lawford paid the highest price of all. As the messenger who had delivered the news that ended the friendship, Peter became the target of Frank's lasting rage. Frank cut Peter out of the Rat Pack completely. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop were forced to choose sides. They chose Frank. Peter's career never recovered. The man who had once been at the center of Hollywood's most powerful social circle found himself blacklisted, unemployable, forgotten. Frank's revenge on Peter was complete and merciless. Frank Sinatra stood in his living room for 5 minutes after hanging up on Peter Lawford, staring at nothing, processing what had just happened. 30 years of friendship, millions of dollars spent on Jack's campaigns, countless favors called in, bridges burned, enemies made in service of Jack Kennedy's political ambitions. And it was ending with a phone call from his brother-in-law explaining that the President of the United States would rather stay with Bing Crosby. The rage started slowly, like a pot coming to boil. Frank walked through his compound, looking at everything he had done to prepare for Jack's visit. The new furniture in the presidential suite, the secure phone lines, the reinforced windows, the staff he had hired and trained specifically to serve a president, all of it now useless, all of it now a monument to his own stupidity. Frank picked up the phone and called Peter Lawford back. Peter answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for Frank's reaction. "Peter, I want to talk to Jack, right now." "Frank, he's in a meeting with Up. I don't care if he's meeting with Khrushchev himself. Get him on the phone." "Frank, please, try to understand." "Understand what? That I've been thrown away like yesterday's garbage? That 30 years of friendship means nothing? Get Jack on the phone, Peter, or I'm coming to Washington to have this conversation in person." There was a long pause. "He won't take your call, Frank. I'm sorry, but he won't." The words hit Frank like a slap across the face. Jack Kennedy, the man Frank had helped make president, wouldn't even take his phone call, wouldn't even have the courtesy to explain his decision directly. "So you're the messenger boy now, Peter? Jack doesn't have the balls to tell me himself?" "Frank, this isn't personal." "The hell it isn't personal," Frank exploded. "Everything about this is personal. Jack is choosing his brother over his friend. He's choosing politics over loyalty. He's choosing respectability over the people who put him in that office. Frank slammed the phone down and stood there shaking with fury. But this wasn't just anger at Jack Kennedy. This was rage at himself, at his own naivety. He had believed that friendship meant something in politics. He had believed that loyalty was a two-way street. He had believed that Jack Kennedy was different from every other politician who had used him and thrown him away. George Jacobs, Frank's loyal valet, appeared in the doorway. He could see the storm brewing in Frank's face and knew to tread carefully. "Mr. S., should I cancel the catering for this weekend?" Frank looked at him with wild eyes. "Cancel everything, George. Cancel the whole goddamn thing." Frank walked outside to the backyard, to the helicopter pad that had cost him $75,000 and represented everything he had hoped his friendship with Jack could become. The concrete was perfect, smooth as glass, marked with the presidential seal that would never be used. Frank stared at it for a long moment, and then something inside him snapped. He stormed into his garage and emerged with a sledgehammer. George Jacobs watched in horror as Frank Sinatra, dressed in an expensive suit, began attacking the helicopter pad with savage fury. Each swing of the sledgehammer sent chunks of concrete flying. Each impact echoed across the desert like gunfire. Frank swung again and again, destroying the symbol of a friendship that had just been destroyed itself. "Mr. S., please," George pleaded. "You're gonna hurt yourself." But Frank couldn't hear him. Frank was lost in a rage that had been building for months, ever since Bobby Kennedy had started his war on organized crime. Ever since the FBI had started watching Frank's every move. Ever since Jack had started treating him like a liability instead of an asset. Frank swung the sledgehammer until his arms ached, until his expensive suit was soaked with sweat, until the presidential seal was nothing but rubble. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, the helicopter pad was destroyed beyond repair. But Frank wasn't finished. He went back into the house and started making phone calls, first to his lawyer, then to his accountant, then to contacts in the press. If Jack Kennedy wanted to treat him like an enemy, Frank would show him what having Frank Sinatra as an enemy really meant. But Jack had made a crucial error in judgment. He had assumed that his younger brother Bobby would go along with the arrangement. He had assumed that Bobby would understand the political realities that had made their victory possible. Jack was wrong. Robert F. Kennedy had been appointed Attorney General partly because Jack trusted him, but mostly because he needed someone in that position who couldn't be corrupted or compromised. Bobby was a true believer, a man who saw the world in black and white, good and evil. To Bobby Kennedy, organized crime wasn't a necessary evil or a political reality to be managed. It was a cancer that needed to be cut out of American society. When Bobby discovered the extent of his brother's connections to Sam Giancana, he was horrified. Not just politically horrified, but morally outraged. The idea that his brother owed his presidency to the mob was unthinkable. Bobby demanded that Jack cut all ties with organized crime immediately and permanently. Jack found himself caught between his loyalty to Frank and his loyalty to Bobby, between his debt to Sam Giancana and his responsibility as president, between the promises he had made to get elected and the promises he had made to govern honorably. The pressure intensified when J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, presented Jack with a thick file of photographs and surveillance reports. The file documented Frank's meetings with Sam Giancana, their conversations, their business dealings. Hoover made it clear that if this information became public, it would destroy the Kennedy presidency. "Mr. President," Hoover said during a private meeting in the Oval Office, "your association with Mr. Sinatra is a national security risk. Every conversation you have with him is potentially being monitored by organized crime figures. Every visit to his home puts you in contact with known criminals." Jack tried to defend Frank. Frank Sinatra is a patriotic American who has supported this administration. Frank Sinatra is a conduit between the White House and the mob. Hoover interrupted. "As long as you maintain a personal relationship with him, this administration will be vulnerable to blackmail, scandal, and worse." Bobby was even more direct. "Jack, you have to choose. The presidency or Frank Sinatra. You can't have both." The decision tormented Jack for weeks. Frank wasn't just a political ally. He was one of Jack's closest friends. They had shared so much together: women, secrets, dreams of power. Frank had been there for Jack during the loneliest moments of his political career. Frank had delivered the presidency when no one else could. But ultimately, Jack Kennedy chose to be president rather than Frank Sinatra's friend. The Palm Springs visit was supposed to be Jack's way of saying goodbye to Frank without actually saying goodbye. One last weekend together before the political realities of Washington forced them apart permanently. But Bobby convinced Jack that even one last visit was too dangerous, too risky, too compromising. And so the phone call was made. Peter Lawford, the messenger no one wanted to be, had to tell Frank Sinatra that 30 years of friendship was ending with a change of travel plans. Frank hung up the phone and walked out to his backyard, staring at the helicopter pad he had built for a president who would never land there. "That's impossible," Frank said. "There has to be some mistake. Jack and I have been planning this for months." "Frank, I'm sorry." The decision came from the top, from Bobby. Bobby, Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General, Jack's younger brother, and Frank's worst enemy in the administration. Bobby had never liked Frank's connections to organized crime, had never trusted his influence over the president, and now, apparently, Bobby had won. "This is about Sam, isn't it?" Frank said quietly. Peter didn't answer, which was answer enough. Sam Giancana, Frank's friend, Frank's ally, Frank's connection to the Chicago mob that had helped deliver the presidency. Bobby Kennedy had been waging war against organized crime since taking office, and Sam was his primary target. The FBI had Sam under constant surveillance, his phone tapped, his movements monitored, and by extension, they were watching everyone who associated with Sam, including Frank Sinatra. "Bobby convinced Jack that staying at your place would be a security risk," Peter said finally. "Too much heat from the Bureau, too many questions from the press." Frank stared out at the helicopter pad, at the presidential seal gleaming in the desert sun, at the symbol of a friendship he thought would last forever. "Frank, you there?" "Yeah, Peter, I'm here. Tell Jack." Frank paused, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal how completely devastated he was. "Tell Jack I understand." But Frank Sinatra didn't understand, and he would never forgive Frank Sinatra and John F. Kennedy had been friends since 1944, back when Jack was a young naval officer recovering from his PT 109 injuries, and Frank was still struggling to break free from Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. They met at a USO show in Los Angeles. Two ambitious young men from very different worlds who somehow clicked immediately. Jack was everything Frank wasn't: educated at Harvard, born into wealth, destined for greatness. Frank was everything Jack envied: self-made, streetwise, beloved by millions. Their friendship deepened through the late 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds. Frank would visit Jack in Washington when he was a congressman, then a senator. Jack would come to Frank's shows whenever he was in New York or Los Angeles. They shared women, secrets, and dreams. Frank called Jack president, even years before it became true. Jack called Frank the voice, not because of his singing, but because Frank had a way of saying exactly what Jack was thinking, but couldn't say publicly. By 1960, Frank Sinatra had become more than Jack Kennedy's friend. He had become Jack's unofficial campaign manager for Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Frank organized fundraising dinners that brought in unprecedented amounts of money. He convinced other celebrities to support Kennedy when most of Hollywood was backing Nixon. He used his influence with organized labor to deliver crucial union endorsements. But Frank's most valuable contribution to Jack's campaign was something that could never be publicly acknowledged. Frank's connections to organized crime, specifically his friendship with Sam Giancana, helped deliver the electoral votes that made the difference between victory and defeat. Sam Momo Giancana was the boss of the Chicago crime family and one of the most powerful men in America. He controlled the unions, the politicians, and the voting machines in crucial swing states. When Frank asked Sam to help Jack Kennedy win the presidency, Sam agreed, not out of love for Kennedy, but out of love for Frank. The deal was simple. Sam would use his influence to deliver Illinois, and possibly other states, to Kennedy. In return, a Kennedy administration would go easy on organized crime. The FBI would back off their investigations, the Justice Department would focus on other priorities. It was a devil's bargain, but one that Jack Kennedy accepted through Frank as his intermediary. Illinois was decided by fewer than 9,000 votes. Without Sam Giancana's Chicago machine stuffing ballot boxes, intimidating opposition voters, and manipulating vote counts, Richard Nixon would have been president. Jack Kennedy owed his entire presidency to organized crime, and everyone involved knew it. For the first year of his administration, Jack kept his end of the bargain. FBI investigations into mob activities slowed down. Prosecutions of organized crime figures dropped dramatically. Sam Giancana felt safe enough to openly brag about his role in making Kennedy president. March 24th, 1962, Palm Springs, California. Frank Sinatra was putting the finishing touches on the presidential suite when the phone rang. He'd spent 3 weeks and $250,000 transforming his compound into a West Coast White House. New security systems, communications equipment, even a helicopter pad built specifically for Air Force One. President John F. Kennedy was coming to stay for the weekend, and Frank wanted everything to be perfect. But the voice on the other end of that phone call was about to destroy a 30-year friendship with 6 words that would echo through the desert like gunshots. The president has changed his plans. To understand the magnitude of what happened that March weekend in Palm Springs, you need to understand what Frank Sinatra and John F. Kennedy meant to each other. They weren't just friends. They were brothers in every way that mattered. Frank had known Jack since the 1940 seconds, back when Jack was just another rich kid from Massachusetts with political ambitions. Frank had watched him grow from a young congressman into a senator and finally into the most powerful man in the world. But more than that, Frank had helped make it happen. In 1960, when Jack was running for president against Richard Nixon, Frank Sinatra became his secret weapon. Frank organized fundraisers that brought in millions of dollars. He performed at campaign rallies that drew crowds Nixon could only dream of. He used his connections in organized labor to deliver crucial union votes. And perhaps most importantly, Frank used his influence with certain unsavory characters to ensure that key swing states fell into Kennedy's column. The 1960 election was the closest in American history. Illinois made the difference between victory and defeat. And Illinois was delivered to Jack Kennedy by Sam Giancana's Chicago machine at Frank Sinatra's personal request. Frank had called in every favor he'd accumulated over 20 years in show business to put his friend in the White House. In return, Jack Kennedy had given Frank something no entertainer had ever possessed: direct access to presidential power. Frank could pick up the phone and reach the Oval Office anytime he wanted. He attended state dinners, advised on appointments, even influenced policy decisions. The kid from Hoboken had become an unofficial member of the Kennedy administration. Frank's compound in Palm Springs had become a second Camp David. Jack would fly out whenever he needed to escape Washington, bringing senators, cabinet members, even foreign dignitaries. They would discuss affairs of state by the pool, make deals on the golf course, plan political strategy over Frank's famous spaghetti dinners. The press called it the Western White House, and Frank couldn't have been prouder. The March 1962 visit was supposed to be the crown jewel of their friendship. Jack was coming alone, without the usual political entourage, for what Frank understood would be a purely personal weekend. 2 old friends, relaxing, reminiscing, planning the future. Frank had spent weeks preparing, installing a new telephone system that connected directly to the Pentagon, upgrading the guest bedrooms with furniture worthy of a president. Most importantly, Frank had built the helicopter pad. It had cost him $75,000 and required special permits from 3 different government agencies. But Frank wanted Jack to be able to arrive and depart with maximum security and minimum fuss. The pad was a perfect circle of concrete in Frank's backyard, marked with the presidential seal, ready for the most important guest in American history. Frank was inspecting the communications equipment one final time when his assistant, George Jacobs, brought him the phone. "Mr. S., it's Peter Lawford. Says it's urgent." Peter Lawford was Frank's brother-in-law through the Rat Pack, married to Jack's sister, Pat Kennedy. He was also Jack's unofficial liaison to Hollywood, the man who coordinated the president's West Coast activities. If Peter was calling with urgent news, it had to be about Jack's visit. Frank took the phone with a smile. "Peter, everything ready on your end? Jack's plane lands in 4 hours." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Peter finally spoke, his voice was strained, uncomfortable. "Frank, we need to talk. There's been a change of plans." Frank's smile faded. "What kind of change?" "The president. He's not going to be staying at your place this weekend. Frank felt his stomach drop. What do you mean he's not staying here? Where else would he stay? Another pause. He's staying at Bing Crosby's house. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Bing Crosby, his professional rival, his political opposite, a Republican who had actively campaigned against Kennedy in 1960. Jack was choosing to stay with Bing Crosby instead of his oldest friend in Hollywood.